Hello, my name is Parker, and ostensibly this is a Python channel, but sometimes I just want to talk about stuff that I find interesting, and today I'm going to talk about how all of these phones are related. So just going from left to right to introduce our main characters, this is the Palm Pre 2, announced and released in 2010. This is the Palm Pixie Plus, both announced and released in 2010. This is the Nokia N9, announced and released in 2011. This is the HTC Ozone, announced and released in 2009. And then finally, this is the Nokia E7, announced in 2010, released early 2011. So, I've broken these down into three categories. These two were devices for HTC and Nokia to raise funds for their future products and projects. The Nokia N9 is the result of a successful fundraising. And then the Palm Pre 2 and the Pixie Plus were the results of a company that bet all in on an idea and didn't have any fundraisers to fall back on. Now, I can't say anything new about the Palm products and webOS that hasn't been said already, and I have no new insights about the N9 and MeeGo. I will say that for collectors that felt they missed out, you can buy these new on eBay, but they all come from China, and so just be aware, all of these apps down here are Chinese apps that can't be removed, and they gimmicked the operating system so that you can no longer use the VGA front camera. Keep that in mind. And for Palm people, so I used this Pixie Plus all throughout middle school, and then my sister used it for a bit while she was in high school, and the soft touch coating on the back cover just completely disintegrated, so we just started using it with no back cover whatsoever. But we absolutely loved this. In fact, we used it so much that the R key just fell off. And I bought the Palm Pre 2 in 2019. Even when I got it out of the box, it was new that some guy just was selling it because he bought it, opened it, put it back. The soft touch coating on here had already started turning back to ooze, and now it's really bad. You can hear it sticking to the table, and yeah, it's sad. The phone still works wonderfully. It's a great device. So the phone will feel terrible but work great. So I made a bold claim about how these two guys were fundraisers for HTC and Nokia. Well, for some context, HTC was big in the Windows Mobile market, and this was announced 1 month after the HTC G1 was announced, the first ever Android smartphone, because the writing was on the wall. People were tired of Windows Mobile. No one wanted it because that operating system felt terrible to use, and iOS showed people what it was like to use a phone that felt good. It was a phone with a touch screen, and everything was designed to be touched. The iPhone was great. Even though iOS 1.0 and 2.0 had their issues, they were natural for people to use. And Windows Mobile was literally, as it sounds, Windows Mobile. You had to interact with the operating system via a physical keyboard and directional keys. There were touch devices, many of them which came from HTC, but touching Windows has never felt good. The only time that touching Windows felt okay was with Windows Phone and Windows 8. But no one actually wanted to touch Windows. They wanted to use it with buttons and keys and stuff like that, which in 2009, no one wanted to interact with their phone via just keys and directional pads. Like, people wanted to touch stuff, and this doesn't even have a touch screen. So this was just a product that they could use to pacify their Windows Mobile customers as they transitioned to Android, and it's obvious they put no care in this whatsoever. I was obsessed with the HTC Ozone when I was in 5th grade. I desperately wanted one because it sounded so cool. It was from HTC. The marketing around HTC products at the time was so futuristic. It was just amazing. And this had a keyboard. I loved physical keyboards at the time, and it was called the Ozone. I mean, what's not to love about that? But when I bought this last fall, as soon as I took it out of the box, the bubble popped. The dream was ruined. This feels terrible. This was every possible expense that could be spared was. HTC needed a product with huge margins that they could get out while they invested all of their remaining R&D budget in Android products. The HTC Dream, from what people said, was a fairly well-built phone. People really liked that and the HTC Magic and the first few Android phones that HTC put out. But this feels like a toy. It's light, the plastic feels cheap, the keys don't feel good to press. They're both too small and too resistive to actually type fast on it. Like it was so sad, and Windows Mobile is terrible for all the reasons you may expect. And in 2009, HTC released a smartphone with a 2-megapixel camera that shoots VGA video. There's no internal storage on this, and in fact, you can't even dock it to your computer without a micro SD card being inserted. This was terrible, but they just needed something to get them by while they moved to Android. And the Nokia E7 is similar, but Nokia actually put effort into their products at the time. This feels amazing. It's made of metal. I mean, just, oh my gosh. And they put so much effort into their cameras at the time. This is an 8-megapixel sensor. It shoots 720p video. And get this, physical keyboard. And these keys feel great. They're a bit mushy, but they're big. And, you know, when you press them, they, you know, feel like you're using a keyboard. It's awesome. And this phone I bought secondhand off eBay. It was, I bought it from an Estonian dude. And so it's a quartz keyboard, not QWERTY. And there are even vowels with umlauts, just standard on the keyboard. And there's even a directional pad. It's amazing. And because this was supposed to be a business-oriented device, there was a dedicated @ symbol. A nice little touch. A nice little touch. Of course, the dedicated enter key and the dedicated backspace button. All wonderful touches. And even though they knew that Symbian was on the way out, they wanted this to be used for business people, as I said. And they gave this an amazingly unique feature at the time. This has a mini HDMI port. So even though they were going to shortly abandon Symbian after the release of the E7 and the N8, they still made sure that the product that they put out was perfect for the people that still wanted Symbian. This was supposed to be their effort to try to take some market away from BlackBerry and Palm, which had gotten a really strong foothold in the productivity and business sector. So there was in fact authoring software for presentations and Word documents that could be installed on Symbian at the time. Unfortunately, the guy who sold me this did a factory reset, so there wasn't any of the document authoring software on here when I bought it. But this device with the mini HDMI port could just power an external display, a whole external display on its own. And it could be used to show presentations and photos and videos. It was great. And there was a unique little feature with their micro USB port here called USB to go, to where if you had a micro USB to USB adapter, you could plug a flash drive into this guy, browse all the files, open pretty much any of them. I mean, there's a native zip app on here. They wanted people to use it for computer stuff. They put so much effort into this, even though they were going to abandon Symbian. And this came with Symbian Bell, which was an overhaul to the Symbian UI that was supposed to make it competitive with iOS at the time, and it feels very natural to use, and it even included some multitasking features, which The multitasking on here is actually very good. Let me just show you how it works. Because people who used Android and iOS at the time, well, feel it's very reminiscent of the time. So, okay, if we want to go to multitasking on Symbian, my cat just sneezed. Bless you, kitty cat. What you do is you hold the home button and it takes you to the multitasking screen. You can see all your apps. And that's pretty much what you did on iOS and Android. With iOS, you would double click the home button, and Android, it depended on the model, but with the physical keys that all Android phones had at the time, there was sometimes a dedicated multitask button, but it wasn't hard to multitask on Symbian. So, 2011, Nokia released the N9. The N9 was a hugely expensive investment. Not only did it have a bespoke operating system, they used entirely new hardware. There's this gorgeous polycarbonate back. The phone has a Carl Zeiss lens on it, and they even included the touch, where the screen is raised slightly above the body of the phone. So when you swipe on it, you can just glide right off. It feels amazing. They thought of every possible thing that people would want in a smartphone and tried to incorporate it. But nothing really came of MeeGo. It was released in 2011, and they never did a follow-up with MeeGo, that is. It also, in 2011, Nokia released the Lumia 800, which used this exact body, down to the gorgeous blue polycarbonate, and this bezel that you see on the bottom just became populated with the capacitive keys for Windows Phone. But why? Why did they spend all of this money developing a gorgeous phone with a wonderful operating system that wanted people to use it? And like they really tried to think of everything that people would want in a mobile operating system, with how easy it was to interact with apps and the multitasking. Why did they abandon it? Well, it's because of these guys. What other company was working on a multitasking focused swipe-based UI? It was Palm. Palm went all in on webOS. They bet their entire company on these products. And in my opinion, webOS was the superior mobile operating system. It was better than BlackBerry for productivity. It felt more natural to use than iOS. And this is coming from someone that used webOS as a kid. I used this Pixie Plus to death in middle school. I loved it. But webOS never had what people wanted. Sure, the fact that multitasking was the feature of the operating system, that when you go between apps, there's this card UI where everything is just available on the home screen. It's kind of like Windows 3, where the desktop doesn't really exist. It's just this floating thing for programs to sit on. And if you want to go to the actual software, then you go to a dedicated screen for that. And I loved it. It felt so clean. And people who like Linux will see that this only appears to be a few layers of abstraction above, like desktop Linux, which as a kid, I couldn't appreciate it. But as an adult who uses Linux a lot, it just makes webOS seem even better in retrospective. But like I said, it didn't have what people wanted. People wanted apps. They wanted software. They didn't really care about how good it was to interact with that software. At the time, I can't remember which keynote Apple gave, but they contrasted that I think over 100,000 apps that the App Store had to Android, BlackBerry, and webOS. And even BlackBerry had more apps than webOS. WebOS at the time of that keynote only had like 6,000 apps, and a lot of apps that people really loved on iOS and Android, even BlackBerry, just weren't there because this guy used a custom Linux kernel. Developing for this was not easy because it had to support all the weird multitasking features of this phone. It had to be able to interact with this typing-based search UI. There were so many quirks that a developer would have to incorporate into their app that they didn't have to do with Android and iOS. They were so much easier for developers to work with. Because of that, they perpetually lagged behind the software, and that's what people wanted. And by the time that Nokia released the Ed9, the writing was on the wall for Palm. Even though they had beautiful, easy-to-use phones, the vastly superior operating system, the gorgeous UIs, they were failing. No one was buying Palm devices. The writing was on the wall. No matter how innovative the company was, if they didn't have the software, it didn't matter. And so, a bespoke operating system released in 2011 would not have 100,000 apps. It wouldn't even have 6,000. And thankfully, Nokia didn't go all in. Palm decided to cannibalize their whole company, their PDAs and their PDA smartphones for webOS. They went all in because they knew they had the superior product and they thought people would see that. And while they did, they didn't want the innovation as much as they wanted software, just things to do on their phone. If they needed robust multitasking, well, they would use a computer. They didn't need all of that in a smartphone, and I showed how easy it was to multitask on operating systems contemporary to webOS and MeeGo. It wasn't hard. It wasn't hard at all. So they didn't need a bespoke operating system to multitask better. People were willing to hold a home button for a couple seconds, to double click it, to touch a dedicated hardware button to go between apps. They didn't need a whole operating system for that. So Nokia realized that their investment for this was for naught. They made a really cool product that was absolutely innovative, that served as the basis for our modern swipe-based UIs, but it didn't matter. They knew they wouldn't have the software that iOS and Android had, and it wouldn't come for years. But they knew they had to move away from Symbian. Even though Symbian was overhauled, it still had the same software problems. There weren't a lot of Symbian apps compared to, Android or iOS, and people thought Symbian was old. Symbian was one of the first, smart OSs that you could get on mobile phones, but Symbian before Bell was terrible to use. It was still better than Windows Mobile, as everything was. Even the clunky Palm 1 OS that came on their PDAs and PDA smartphones like the Treo and Centro. It was just the worst option, but yeah. So even though Symbian was okay, it just wasn't able to keep up with Android and iOS. So Nokia was going to fail if they didn't move to something else, and I don't know why they didn't move to Android. But they needed something to keep them afloat because MeeGo was going nowhere, so they decided to partner with Microsoft, because Microsoft was kind of too big to fail. With the Windows Phone that they were moving to, they were going all in on that. And even though the devices may have been a commercial flop, because Windows Phone at the time still had the app problem. In 2011, Windows Phone was brand new, so of course there weren't going to be 100,000 apps or 10,000 apps, but it was backed by Microsoft, who was going to keep these projects afloat while they gained commercial traction. And so Nokia didn't want to bet on Android. They needed something secure because they invested so much money on this. And in fact, they just reused this body for the Lumias. because why not? This was gorgeous. This feels like something taken out of the future. This feels like a phone. You know, it's like that Harry Styles thing. You know, instead of a movie that feels like a movie, this is a phone that feels like a phone. Like, it feels awesome. So, of course, if they were going to abandon the thing that they put their heart and soul into, why not just cannibalize the frame for this? I mean, all they did for the Lumia 800 was add buttons. But yeah, thankfully, Palm failing prevented an instant failure from Nokia. They were able to give us something really, really cool, but they didn't bet their whole company on it. And they were able to finance that transition away from the MeeGo operating system to Microsoft thanks to having stable products, like the E7, which was still being sold in 2011. So while MeeGo was an instant flop and Windows Phone was, you know, on the horizon, they still had the sales from the E7 and the N8 to just hold them over. And as you can see, on the E7, this is basically like if the N8 had a sliding keyboard. So they were able to save money, even though they spent a lot of money on developing a holdover device like the E7. They were able to reuse just a lot of elements that they took from the chassis of this guy for the N8. So unfortunately, as innovative as Palm was, they were too smart, and they lacked the business sense on how to actually move forward. And that's why they failed. They didn't have their stable products to fall back on, like HTC with the Ozone and Nokia with the E7. Nokia was able to experiment and walk away from the experiment still with the company. And of course, Nokia still kind of failed in the long run. They were bought by Microsoft, and Microsoft totally cannibalized them and bastardized the Nokia brand. And Nokia still kind of lives on today, but they just licensed the Nokia name to HMD Global. So, in my opinion, the real Nokia died with the N9. This was the last true Nokia device. And I mean, some people could say it was the 808 Pure View because that was the last Symbian product. And so they, let Symbian go out with a bang with that monster of a camera phone with the 808 Pure View. But this is the last true Nokia product. So, thank you for watching this video. I promise I'll switch back to Python content. And oh, if you're wondering about where this black spot on my finger came from, this came from, oh my God, did you hear this unstick from the table? This came from cleaning off some of the goo of the pre. And I've washed my hands several times. I think this goo is now a part of my skin. But more Python content is coming. I just really wanted to talk about these guys, and I had the time. So thank you, and hit that subscribe button if you would like to see more content. I love talking, so I'll be around. Hope you all have a great rest of your day.